Greeting, friends, one and all. Welcome to the Merry Corncrakes podcast with me, your host, Nathan Hood. We are affiliated with the Corncrake magazine, which produces fantastic stories in digital magazine form every month. Go to corncrakemag.com right now, or at least after this video, to read it and enjoy some of the great stories, both classic and by independent authors today. And it is my great pleasure on this summer day to welcome a good friend and a long-time contributor to the Corncrake. It is Mr. A.R. Green. Hello, A.R. How are you doing, sir?
Hello, thank you. I'm doing very well. Thank you for the lovely introduction there.
Oh, no problem at all. I mean, you have been writing for the Corncrake for several months now, and you've got your own kind of series going on, and there's bits of poetry in there as well. So you're a long-time friend of the Corncrake and of myself. So I'm very grateful for you coming on. And how this kind of came about, this video, is you had come across another video on YouTube that you wanted to discuss. And while I bring it up, do you want to say a little bit about it and what struck you about it?
Yeah, I think it was quite an interesting video that popped up on my feed, and the way that it popped up on my feed and the channel itself seemed a bit odd to me, because obviously, you know, the algorithm pushes things and certain things on you. Sorry. So obviously the algorithm pushes certain things on you, and this was one of the things that it happened to push on us. And then when I watched the video and was fascinated by the video and what this lady here had to say. And then I dug a little bit deeper and went, oh, she's only got 11 videos and I think at the time it was around about 25,000 subscribers, which just marked her out as a little bit odd to me to some degree for someone to have so few videos with so many views as well. And with so many subscribers, like I say, normally it takes quite a while to build up a channel of that size, and it just seems to have just sprung from nowhere.
It is interesting. I mean, the channel's been going for several months, and she's tended to do like a video a month. And what struck me when I looked through her channel is most of the videos are on like story writing technique or how she's doing her story. And then we get this video, which is a bit different, and looking at the historical development of the fantasy genre and how she thinks it's been totally turned on its head. So it is interesting how she's kind of sprung up. And several people, when I was doing some research on this, said, oh, this has just come up in my feed too. So it was like a sudden push for this video all of a sudden, which is kind of ironic given the subject matter of it, I would say. But yes, what we were planning to do was just to go through it play by play. And so, AR, if there's anything you want to come in and comment on, well, as we play it, just say, and I'll stop the video and we'll go from there. So
yep, will do. Brilliant.
Alrighty, let's get going.
If you've been following me for any length of time, then by now you should know how I feel about formulas. Not to overstate things, but formulas in terms of their overall impact on literature, book industry, and storytelling as a craft and an art destroy everything. But in this video, what I want to focus on in particular is the fantasy genre. I don't know if you know this, but fantasy as a literary genre with its section in the bookstore is actually pretty new. There are some of you who probably even remember a time before the fantasy genre. Not that fantasy literature and storytelling didn't exist before, it certainly did. And I'm not just talking about mythological tales and fairy stories, but fantastical, inventive, groundbreaking, epic fantasy. But what I'm saying is that fantasy as a type of story that people tell has always existed. Fantasy as a genre at the bookstore is pretty much a modern American invention. And
I just want to come in on this because I think there's some truth to it. Like, I think instinctively we recognize that what somebody like William Morris was writing, the Well at the End of the World, or if we go back further to the Norse sagas, and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, which is a big part of this video, seems very different from something like Game of Thrones or The Wheel of Time or other kind of fantasy books, sword and sorcery books that we would see in Waterstones today. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think there is a quite marked difference between the sort of it's the historical link. You can tell the difference between someone that's actually trying to pick up that link and continue it on forward into the future, and what the likes of George R. R. Martin have done, whereby they've kind of just cribbed off it and then gone off and done their own thing, almost separate from the continuation of the link. Certainly with George R. R. Martin, because you can see that rather than picking up the link and continuing it, he's actively trying to smash it. He's trying to break it.
Yes, that's very true, and others as well that were intentionally trying to undermine original traditional mythology and fantasy. I guess as well, one thing I would say too is that a lot of modern fantasy, like to me, D&D fits this category, or Baldur's Gate. It feels like it's unmoored from its mythological foundations. Even if it's not actively trying to undermine traditional stories, they don't feel like they belong together.
Yes, I'd agree. To some degree, I think it's the beginning of mass and scale creeping in, especially when you start talking about things like D&D. It's, you've got spreadsheets explaining things, and that's not what myth making traditionally was about. It wasn't a spreadsheet. It was, your songs, tales, myths.
Well, let's continue.
Today, we're going to talk about how that invention, the fantasy genre at the bookstore, came to be, and why and how it destroyed fantasy literature.
Sorry about that, fellows. I still need to get ad blocker, but as I'm running a YouTube channel, maybe I shouldn't.
The fantasy genre start. Lord of the Rings.
He's the father of all modern fantasy. Tolkien essentially created modern fantasy.
Wrong. Tolkien didn't create anything but a world and some stories that took place in it. The fantasy genre was not only not created by Tolkien, it had nothing at all to do with Tolkien. While the modern fantasy genre as we know it was being created, Tolkien was hanging out with his buddy C.S. Lewis in England, teaching classes, raising his kids, painting, and, doing Tolkien things like talking to trees or whatever. But Martin's opinion here is indicative.
I think this almost lays into what we've just been discussing, whereby, Tolkien feels like he's continuing a different tradition. He's not part of the fantasy, certainly not the modern fantasy as we envision it. They obviously drew a lot from him, but it feels like a child scribbling, drawing copy of what Tolkien did.
That's a good way to put it. I mean, oftentimes I'll say to people, maybe the main similarity with Tolkien is maybe the different creatures and species within his world are carried over. So you've got elves and dwarves and orcs and goblins and wizards and so on. That is a kind of common staple in a lot of fantasy writing, video games, board games, etc. But the actual kind of thing which binds all of those things together is not the same. And I think that to me, whereas somebody like C.S. Lewis's work, which is not just copying Tolkien's characters and species, although it does have a different feel, to me it is more continuous with Tolkien than a lot of fantasy is.
Yeah, I think it's along the lines of C.S. Lewis was drawn from the same tradition that Tolkien was. He wasn't going down this weird kind of... It's almost as if it's sort of similar to what we have with AI now, where it's just kind of trying to copy the form and then just fill it. It's copying the form in a formulaic manner, whereby it treats the elements of Tolkien's story like a tick box exercise. You have them going through, saying, you got elves, yep, check. You got dwarves, yep, check. And it's literally, that's the approach that seems to have been taken with fantasy as a genre.
I was talking to Bros Crin on an earlier episode of the Merry Corncrakes, and we got talking about how a lot of fantasy writers are drawing on other fantasy writers rather than the mythology that Tolkien was. And so you get this idea of the simulacrum, that they're taking the symbols or the signs which used to refer to the older stuff or to reality, and then imitating those. And so at the end, you only get the signs rather than anything which is touching on reality itself at a fundamental level. So that, to me, that's that kind of imitative process. If you're just copying the symbols and not being inspired by the world around you, the world expressed in traditional mythology, etc., which all of those things are expressions of, then you've lost something along the way. It's an empty symbol with nothing underneath it now.
Yeah, it ends up just being a copy of a copy of a copy, where it's so abstracted from the reality that initially inspired it that it's just completely lost all meaning. It's just gone completely. And it just ends up where it's not worth reading. It just becomes mass and scale reproduction.
Let us continue.
What is generally accepted to be true, that fantasy, as we know it today, is the product of J.R.R. Tolkien. But it's not. Have you ever stopped to wonder why we've never had another Tolkien? Another Lord of the Rings, another universally captivating fantasy masterwork? It's been almost 100 years since The Lord of the Rings was initially published in England, and since that time, the fantasy genre has, for one thing, come into existence, but also has blossomed into a massive phenomenon all its own. With all the fantasy works and mega works that get published every year, why has there never been one that was so unique, so genuine, so pure in terms of creativity, that it became an overnight defining work of an entire civilization? And no.
I want to ask you this question before we actually get into her answer to this. Beyond what you've already seen from her and what you know she's going to say, why do you think that we haven't had another Tolkien?
I think many artists are trapped within the paradigm of mass and scale. It's a case of rather than actually trying to think outside the box, they don't even realize that they're living within a box. So they just continue on thinking, oh, if I do this thing right, I could become as good as Tolkien, never realizing that they're literally trapped within his shadow. And it's near impossible for them to actually escape that shadow without doing something completely and utterly off the wall in terms of modernity, but which would make complete and utter sense to anyone of Tolkien's era or before. We've just, it's modern man navel gazing. He's just completely and utterly self-absorbed and not realized that there was wisdom before us, and it's worth just trying to go back and dig it up. There was a space recently on Twitter which it had some interesting points with it, and one of them was basically that there is no new creation under the sun. It's all been done before, but we seem to have got to the point where we've decided we need something novel, we need something new. And in our quest for new and novel, we have thrown out that which works and lost it. So at this point, you could do something novel and new just by going back and looking through what was done before and trying to copy the means and method rather than just directly copying the thing itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would add to that I think somebody like Tolkien was truly a genius. I think it's easy to underplay that, but his knowledge of his philological ability was exceptional. Combining that with his rich knowledge of literature and understanding of deep themes about the world, he had great penetrating insight. And we've kind of lost that sense in a lot of our discourse of there's some periods which give rise to geniuses more than others. There's some periods which support geniuses more than others. And at that point, he was fortunate in some ways to have this, to be in a group like the Inklings with C.S. Lewis, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, who were all operating at a very similar level with a shared reverence for their faith and the traditions that they've inherited, and wanting to kind of push each other further in that. It was a perfect storm for somebody like him to produce the Lord of the Rings in a way that I think we would struggle to see anything like that today, in terms of the people and in terms of the possibility of that kind of forum.
I think I would agree and disagree to some degree. I think the sort of genius of Tolkien and that which produces that genius comes from immense suffering, which is exactly what Tolkien and many of his friends within the Inkling saw during both of the wars.
Yeah.
You had that level of suffering, which we haven't had directly. We've had a very, very different kind of suffering. And I think it's going to create a slightly different kind of genius.
No, I think that's a very good point. That's a very good point. And if we look at, you know, their works are so tinged with the experience of World War One, which I've often said is Britain's Iliad, and we still haven't really come to terms with it or had that Homeric epic perhaps for it. But that was, you know, it kind of did something very fundamental, and you get superficial things fall away when you're recalling your account of the Somme. You know, it's you deal with fundamentals at that point.
Yeah, absolutely, I'd agree. I think it's the way they always do say, you know, you've got to suffer for your art. And I think that the suffering that we're facing right now is markedly different from what I think a lot of people have suffered in throughout all of human history. I think we're in a very, very unique place. I imagine it has happened before. My gut instinct tells me it probably happened in a very similar manner during the fall of Rome and possibly even with the Bronze Age collapse. And it's a case of maybe the literature and thoughts that would have existed within that time were simply lost. They just didn't get through because the civilizations fell and there was nothing to carry forward. There was all of, you know, it's kind of like the Library of Alexandria burning. It burns away and all the knowledge is just gone.
That is completely.
Thrones does not count. One of the first biggest issues I would like to point out is that as wonderful, and I mean wonderful, as Tolkien is, he didn't do anything that unusual. His books are absolutely magical. His world building is god tier. But at a certain point, you have to take a step back and look at it. At that point, you realize that Tolkien's work, while special and beloved and perfectly crafted, is not as special as I think we've come to understand, in the sense that it was never really intended to be one of a kind. The main thing that kind of tricks us into thinking his work is so one of a kind is that there has never been anything like him since. My question is, why is that?
But that being said, Tolkien did certain things that are different than what I would do.
I don't know about you, but I find all this incredibly tedious. Oh, I'm going to be the anti-Tolkien. And then, oh, I'm going to be the anti-George R.R. Martin. I don't know, guys, maybe you could just write your damn story. The main thing to look at here is that Martin, like most or all modern fantasy writers, has defined himself in part by how different he is from what he sees as the legacy of J.R.R. Tolkien. That right there is a pretty decent encapsulation.
I will agree with her there. I think that you can almost see it. We deviate from the path of continuing on the tradition, and then we end up with all of these people just being like, oh, I'm going to define myself by being in opposition to what Tolkien was doing. And then you get it where it continues on. It's this continual negative spiral downwards, where it's, oh, I'm going to be the opposite of what George is doing. And no one's really trying to reach back and pick up the chain and be like, come on, guys, how about we just try to go forward instead of defining ourselves purely in negative terms of, oh, I'm the opposite of this person.
Well, and the kind of flip side of that is if you're defining yourself in what you're against, you're giving power to the thing which you're against. You have to kind of live off that disagreement or that antagonism with them. So you're actually creating a kind of space where the two of you have to be locked in eternal battle. So Martin doesn't make sense without his opposition to Tolkien, and so he's defined, at least how he presents it. His work is totally defined by Tolkien. Then in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Funnily enough, there's a funny comparison to make there, which is with Harry Potter and Voldemort. Voldemort is basically defined as a negative.
Yes, yes. Yes, that's very true. And I suppose this is true also of just like politics, for example. If you're defined by what you're against,
absolutely,
you're conceding power, and like if you have starting from your own positive vision, that gives you strength, and things are going to react to you. They're going to be shaped by your vision as a consequence.
Yes, the Dark Lord certainly would know about that.
Encapsulation of the current fantasy publishing industry. It is a bottomless salad of tropes and formulas, and then subverted tropes and counter formulas, with nothing unique or original, or even just purely the creation of its author. But how did we get here? How did we arrive in a world where people proudly refer to Game of Thrones as the American Lord of the Rings? Something that seriously concerns me.
Pause very briefly. That's quite interesting what you just said there, where it's, people defined in opposition. So obviously we're talking about people being defined in opposition. Lost what I was going to say.
It's okay. It's okay. I mean, one thing I was going to say is if we're talking about that, and George R. R. Martin defines himself as against Tolkien, and then he's defined as the America's Tolkien. That's quite an interesting, like, commentary.
It is quite
on
the
America.
statement. It is quite the comment. Like you say, it is quite the statement to say, yes, George R. R. Martin is America's Tolkien. It's like, yes, you are in opposition to everything traditional. That was it. That was what I was going to say. It's funny that she goes on to basically say, like, the unique that we need uniqueness. We need uniqueness. Uniqueness has been lost. You're all just copying off each other. But at the beginning, she'd already opened up saying what Tolkien did wasn't that unique, and she's not wrong. It wasn't that unique. It's uniqueness isn't what you need. You need to be continuing on a well-trod tradition that works. And we moved away from it when we left Tolkien and started fighting with him. It almost feels like, the teenage daughter sparring with the father saying, I'm going to do my own thing, Dad. And it's like, no, you will just follow the tradition.
Yes. It is it does feel like that American rebellious spirit is against the old country is just Martin versus Tolkien in the fantasy world.
Way, however, I almost can't even blame Martin. After all, he is the inheritor of a genre that was killed in the crib. Fantasy, as a literary genre, never had a chance. The road that Tolkien opened up for writers and publishers with the mega popularity of The Lord of the Rings was then paved not by writers and publishers eager to explore this new literary concept, but by an opportunistic salesman who looked at The Lord of the Rings' growing popularity and saw only dollar signs. I'm talking about Lester Del Rey. This is the man who made fantasy into a serious and marketable literary genre, and who also killed.
I do find it hilarious to just conflate Tolkien and money. I don't think that when Tolkien was penning Lord of the Rings, money even entered his head as a thought. I don't think it was even on the horizon. It just wasn't a consideration as far as I'm concerned.
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, a lot of the Lord of the Rings is very, to me, there's a celebration of enjoying a quiet life, which isn't trying to dominate the world, and yet his story, which I agree with you, I don't think he had any intention of, or didn't believe even that it would have the kind of market success that it did, has gone on to kind of have such a powerful impact and make millions and millions of dollars. He probably would have been quite horrified at that result, that it, in some ways, that it had become this kind of giant of corporate entertainment. And then with the films and TV series and action figures and so on, I feel he would have been very uncomfortable with this commodification of his story.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, because obviously a major component of his story is, sort of smash the industry, which a lot of people on the left take to be like, oh, he's our guy, and it's That's one thing that always amuses us. You only need to read Letter 52 to see, oh no, Tolkien was not on your team. He was very much on a different team to you entirely.
Well, I guess I would say to that as well that oftentimes I think a lot of the political divisions that we would put on people don't necessarily apply to, like, take like William Morris or John Ruskin or Tolkien. There's a kind of anarchic principle in there, and by that I don't mean kind of people going around causing chaos. I mean a small government, but it's tied up with if any government, but it's tied up with a pre-industrial way of life. So there's a seeming similarity with progressive politics, but actually what they're pining for is very, very different. It's like pre-industrial medieval Europe or something like that. That's what they're really wanting.
I think Tolkien, in that 52, puts it in no uncertain terms. He basically says, for all, I am anarchistic. I'm anarchistic in the sense of I want a monarch. And he longs for the traditional human connection to the ruler, which would be an anathema to your modern leftists, the idea that, there should be a ruler. And it's like, there should. Not all men are equal. And that's okay. It's just the way that things are. There's nothing wrong with that. You don't need to rage against it like an impudent teen saying, oh, well, why does there have to be you that sets the rules? And it's like, there has to be someone. There has to be someone that sets the rules. It's just the way that the world works. And there's no point in fighting against it because it's a losing battle. You lose it eventually one way or the other.
Yeah, somebody fills the void, and we're going to learn that Lester Del Rey filled that void.
Yes.
Fantasy before it ever even had a chance to come into its own. Let's back up a little bit to 1954, when the first volume of Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, was published in hardcover in America, followed quickly by the rest of the trilogy. I don't know if you know this, but when this happened, it was a massive cultural phenomenon. Newspapers were comparing the fanatical popularity of Tolkien's masterpiece to Beatlemania, especially on campuses where the book had become the novel of choice for youth in general, supplanting even The Catcher in the Rye. America was experiencing major cultural unrest that would change Western civilization forever. JFK had just been assassinated. America was entering the war in Vietnam. Rock music was gaining ground and evolving. Racial issues were consuming the news. Morals were shifting. The sexual revolution was shifting into high gear. The cultural landscape of America was changing seismically. Now, throw into that mess this.
I just wanted to add into this that I think this is one of the interesting intersections here that she doesn't talk on, is actually some of those like rock groups, like Led Zeppelin, for example, are taking on the Lord of the Rings in their own lyrics.
Yes.
Ramble On, or The Battle Forevermore. You've got other groups like Black Sabbath have references to wizards and Gandalf. Uriah Heep, they do as well. And then you've got others who aren't necessarily drawing explicitly on Tolkien, but are certainly influenced by him, like Wishbone Ash, Yes, etc. Now we're moving into the 70s with those groups, but there definitely was a number of them who found in him a kind of expression of that, something deeper than the 60s culture that was emerging around them, that or just life in general in the West, that there was some kind of power within these words to which they sought to bring into their music as well.
It's an almost electric energy. You can, if you're switched on, you can feel it. It just pulses throughout the culture and just shockwaves reverberate.
Yeah.
And like you say, you can see other artists drawing on the energy, saying, yes, this fuels me. I'm going to take this and make something of my own with it. It's the heat from a forge.
That's a good way to put it. That's a really good way to put it. Like a spark of a forge, and then using that for your own beautiful jewel, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, tantalizing energy in there. And it's interesting that you put it that way, because somebody like Mark Bolan, for example, who again I think is clearly influenced by the Lord of the Rings, he literally saying like, my songs are spells, like I am a wizard, in a very dark sense potentially.
I wouldn't
yeah.
go against it. I think there is power in words, and there is a certain magic within words. I mean, if you listen to A, you would absolutely begin to believe that. It feels like he is absolutely weaving some spells and magic at the minute.
Yes. So that's just the perfect synthesis then. The Lord of the Rings, because if you're looking at it now, you would think, how did all of these very avant-garde people and university students and so on, who are probably protesting the Vietnam War, how are they ending up with the Lord of the Rings? But they're tasting something realer than corporate America, realer than the kind of shallow, I would say shallow Beatlemania when that was really at its height. More than just ordinary life that's kind of ticking along in modernity. There's something you can actually just about grasp in the Lord of the Rings, of a more authentic way of being that they want just as much as, but they find it in this story.
Deceptively simple and incredible book. A story that resonated with almost everyone across almost all demographics. Even if you weren't there, you can still imagine how this cosmically perfect timing resulted in something that hadn't ever happened. At least not in America, and not recently. The Lord of the Rings affected everything culturally. And by culturally, I mean mainly the arts. Elves and orcs and dark lords were suddenly everywhere. That was, in the earliest days of this phenomenon, due exclusively to the immense popularity of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Just to give you an idea of how huge this book was, imagine Harry Potter and Game of Thrones rolled into one and dominating like 2 entire decades. This, that is the mid-1960s, was also the time when publishing in America was drastically changing. Publishing houses had previously been companies owned by their founders or their founders' heirs.
It's funny she mentions George R. R. Martin with, Song of Ice and Fire and Harry Potter as well. They have dominated the landscape for quite some time, but I find it quite funny that there's been nothing that's replaced them recently. It's as if there's just a gap, a big hole where literature should sit within the culture at the minute.
I guess a huge part of that is it feels like the book in some ways is in decline as the cultural force, and it's become cinema or TV, especially with streaming and so on, and the rise of the internet and so on. I think that's probably a factor in it, because there is a gap there, and they're just remaking the same thing over and over to fill that gap, but it's not working.
But that's it. Even the TV's become just remake after remake after remake of the same formula again and again and again. And it feels like the well of creativity has completely dried up at this point. Certainly in terms of what the established culture is trying to create. It's as if there's just no energy left. It's all gone. It's all been used up. To which something's going to fill that void, one way or the other. The only thing that I think might throw a spanner into the works is the attention span of Gen Z. Well, yeah. Z. We're English. Gen Z.
Gen Z, indeed.
Yeah. The attention span of Gen Z is the only thing that threatens to dethrone literature, and it's on the grounds of they just can't sit down for long enough to read a book. I've heard some studies suggesting that they can't even sit long enough to watch a full feature-length film.
Oh, absolutely, and especially not without their phones. And I've met enough of them in my kind of working life to think, okay, actually, yeah, a lot of them can't do that anymore. It has to be shorts or short videos, etc.
Yeah, that's it. I could absolutely believe it, having met a couple of Gen Z. That they don't have the attention span to sit through something as long as a film, let alone a book.
Yes, so that's partly why these changes are dethroning and thus leaving a big cultural gap I suppose the fragmentation of culture as well. To me, there's an extent to which the rise of the internet has meant that, whereas before, like if you take like noughties Britain, most people would watch a lot of the same television. You didn't have so many channels, you didn't have the internet to stream your own stuff. So everybody would be talking about Doctor Who, for example, or EastEnders, Top of the Pops, whatever. Like these shows were kind of cultural touch points. But now that these things are not common ground for most people, it's only a subculture that watches the BBC or a subculture that watches Doctor Who, then we don't have that anymore. So there is a vacuum because there's nothing that is binding us all together in terms of culture. We're all off in our different little silos, watching our shorts and talking to people who share those shorts. Maybe Love Island's the closest thing.
How tragic is that?
Love Island's replaced Doctor Who. Yes.
Yeah, we're all deracinated people other than Love Island. We can all get together and discuss that.
Honestly, when I go into certain places during my working week, that is the thing which binds most of the people in the room together. You're just like, I have nothing to say to this. I'm moving on.
The great poets could have wept. It's an absolute weep. Just what has happened to us?
Ponderously slow to change, but nevertheless bulwarks against trend setting for the sake of trend setting and popularity for the sake of popularity. They weren't money makers. That had never been the point of a publishing house at that time, but they could be relied upon to understand what was quality and what was a mere fad. However, this was post-industrial, post-World War II America, and at this time, the old publishing houses were being acquired by mega companies interested only in profits. Most relevant to our topic, in 1965, Random House was acquired by RCA, a conglomerate that was already establishing itself as a producer of televisions and, interestingly, defense contracts. Anyone with a little common sense can understand that starting at...
Yes, how very interesting that they were also involved in defense contracts with the US government. That feels like a very organic company, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not many book publishers who are also producing arms for the US government. I suppose maybe the closest thing today might be Elon Musk, who on the one hand is he with his Starlink and so on, he's working with the US government, he has US government contracts. But then he's also got one of the premier cultural making places in form of Twitter, now X. Like, maybe that's the closest thing I can think of.
Yeah. I just find it quite funny. It's oh no, they're definitely not directly linked to the government. They aren't an arm of the government. They just were making weapons for the government and getting paid absolutely a fortune by the government to continue existing. I'm pretty sure this company would definitely have still existed if the US government hadn't been paying them that much money.
And then also interesting that they're using that money to purchase up or buy up smaller publishers, right? And bring them into their fold.
It is fascinating that this giant company that is dealing in arms manufacture has suddenly decided that it needs to control the entirety of the US publishing industry and bring it in-house.
And well, this is something maybe we could talk about a bit later, but perhaps the unexpected success of The Lord of the Rings, which is a book, as we've been discussing, is very anti-industrial, anti-modern state, let's just say anti-American in some ways, right? At least how it's being defined. If Martin is America's Tolkien, would they want to get control of such a challenging genre before it can flower into something else?
Yeah, absolutely.
At this point, the publishing industry, by and large, no longer cared about quality and never would again. A look at modern publishing will quickly reveal the ultimate embarrassing end of this crucial 1960s phase in American publishing history.
This is how the brain of a procrastinator functions compared
I mean,
to a
we are
high
talking about slot
achiever.
porn.
Now,
It's funny
in
how I get those exact same
1973, when
adverts.
America
What did you say, AR?
It's funny how those adverts have just suddenly popped up, and every time I go on YouTube, I seem to get that procrastination advert, and it's doing my head, and it's like, why is it the same one every time?
Hey, they're trying to stop you from procrastinating. That's why. Allegedly.
But I'm watching a YouTube video. I'm obviously here to procrastinate.
It's a strange campaign. And they go on forever. I couldn't get out of one for a bit because I was watching something else on another screen and it wouldn't let me close it. And it was like
Oh,
5
they
minutes
do.
in. It's like still going.
was still locked into Frodo Lives fever, Random House, under the control of RCA, acquired Ballantine Books. At that time, the senior editor at Ballantine Books was this woman, Judy Lynn Del Rey, the fourth wife of Lester Del Rey. Now, in the future, after the establishment of the Del Rey imprint and the establishment of the Del Rey's control over speculative fiction in America, Judy Lynn Del Rey would mainly be seen as the science fiction side of things, while her husband Lester was fantasy. It's worth noting, however, that both were equally important in the destruction of American speculative fiction. Something that has always bothered me about the Del Reys and their undeniable impact on genre publishing in America is that this is almost always presented as a good thing. Judy Lynn is said to have revolutionized the fantasy genre, and Lester is even sometimes called the creator of the fantasy genre. In a sense, all of that is true, but none of it is good. Just about the only good thing Judy Lynn might have done for genre fiction was to acquire the rights for Star Wars novels before Star Wars had even been released. Nevertheless, even this good deed comes with a caveat. Having established Star Wars as the money-printing machine at Ballantine, she ensured that the science fiction genre going forward was modeled on that formula, just like Lester and Lord of the Rings. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Prior to the Judy Lynn era,
I just want to say on this that she's saying it's always presented in this way as a good thing and actually as a bad thing. Actually, it's the reverse in a lot of the cases, that there's a strong narrative that these guys destroyed science fiction and fantasy fiction. And it's I'm not going to go delve into it yet because she's going to touch on some of the people who promote that narrative and how I think it's a little bit more nuanced. But it's worth saying, like, actually, this is there's a lot of division on this topic. It's not just what she's saying is right or what the others are saying is right. Actually, it's probably it's quite messy.
Fair. I'm interested to see what you have to say because I've not dug into it quite as deeply as you. My gut instinct says maybe they didn't destroy it. However, they absolutely did contain it. This was 100% a containment operation as far as I am concerned from what I have seen.
But let us continue.
At Ballantine, Betty Ballantine had attempted to capitalize on the popularity of Lord of the Rings. As you probably know, when Lord of the Rings was published in America, it was Ballantine who had secured the rights to do so. So already they were printing money. But hoping to turn a single book into an industry, Betty and her husband started the adult fantasy line at Ballantine and hired Lynn Carter to be the editor. Over the next several years, they attempted to reproduce the Tolkien lightning strike by bringing other, older fantasy works of possibly equal quality into the public's view. Works such as Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy, G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, and Lord Dunsany's The King of Elfland's Daughter. But these efforts were largely unsuccessful. In fact, the Ballantine adult fantasy imprint had been more or less abandoned by the time Judy Lynn took over. But who were these Del Reys? Lester.
I do find it funny that she refers to Tolkien's creation as a lightning strike. Because I'm of the opinion that great literature such as what Tolkien created isn't a lightning strike. It's not lightning that you catch in a bottle. I believe that lightning that you catch in a bottle is poetry. It's short, you just bang through it and that's it. It's gone and done. With the likes of what Tolkien created, it is much more methodical. And passing on beyond it being much more methodical, it doesn't rise in prominence the same way. You couldn't get your stories don't just grow and blow up on their own. There is an awfully big amount of effort that is put in to push them up onto the world stage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whereas with the, like I say, with poetry and with shorter format, you can sometimes strike out and get that lightning bolt. The modern equivalent of it is your edits. It's, you know, the edits that you see people doing where they just go massively viral. They feel a bit more organic and like an actual lightning bolt, whereby sometimes they can just break through whatever containment there is. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe even they are just, all part of the formula and controlled, but they feel a bit more genuine.
I know what you're saying, and I think maybe even that attitude played into why this attempt to republish prior fantasy also failed, because it kind of failed to recognize why Tolkien was successful, or Tolkien's work was a hit. And it wasn't just because it was fantasy. It was a certain combination of elements of traditional storytelling in a modern format in post-war Britain, which he kind of forged together. Forging, I think, as you were saying earlier, is a good metaphor for this. Whereas they seem to think, oh, it's just the world that he created. It's kind of like Lord Dunsany. It's like William Morris. Therefore, they will be popular too. Which actually, like, I've read a fair bit of William Morris and I enjoy it, but it's not, to my mind, it's nothing like reading The Lord of the Rings. It's superficially similar. Maybe there's one book that maybe is the most like comparable. I can't remember its exact title, but it's got the Wolfings in it. It's a kind of Anglo-Saxon or Germanic tribe resisting the Romans, and there's a feeling of Theoden riding into the Pelennor Fields kind of vibe to it. But that's it. It's not actually like, that's just one part of the Lord of the Rings. It's not the whole.
Yeah.
And they're extracting like little bits here and there and thinking, okay, that's it. Whereas actually, all of the great things in Morris and Dunsany have been brought together in Tolkien in a new and brilliant way. So just republishing these isn't going to work.
Yeah, to me that almost sounds like borrowing rather than stealing. If you're going to make great art, you should steal. Unironically, you steal the method and you do it. You don't just borrow you don't borrow it. You have to steal it. And I think it was Picasso that said, "Great artists don't borrow, they steal," or something to those effects. And I think he's right. I think you do steal.
Interesting. Well, she will go on to say that they borrow or steal a lot, these guys. So I'll be interested to see how you respond to that bit.
Del Rey, who often liked to claim that this was his full name, was born Leonard Knapp in Minnesota in 1915. He had written prolifically in sci-fi pulp magazines with a teenage target audience. In the 40s, he became an editor and continued in that work for almost 30 years. Judy Lynn had also been an editor, also for science fiction magazines, and had gradually worked her way up the ladder until Betty Ballantine named her as her successor. Thus, in the early 1970s, when America was still in the heat of Tolkien fever, Judy Lynn Del Rey became the senior editor for Ballantine Books. And while she worked to revitalize the publisher's science fiction line, she brought in her husband Lester to address the neglected husk that was the fantasy line. It was 1974, and things were about to change forever. That year, a manuscript made it to Judy Lynn's desk, but seeing as it was fantasy and not her usual science fiction, she gave it to her husband Lester. This manuscript, Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara. Anyone who's even loosely familiar with this book knows that it's pretty much a straight imitation of Tolkien. Most publishers decried such a shamelessly derivative work, but not Lester. When he read The Sword of Shannara, he recognized it for what it really was, minor details aside. A relatively well-told Tolkien ripoff. And unlike his more traditional-minded competitors in the industry, he didn't see a shameless knockoff. He saw dollar signs. The manuscript needed a lot of work, and among the many things Lester insisted that Brooks alter was any hint at the possibility of a science fiction element. As the story was meant to take place in the distant future of Earth after a nuclear apocalypse had decimated and then altered civilization, which, by the way, probably would have made the Sword of Shannara more of its own unique original work and less of an imitation. But no, said Lester. Science fiction and fantasy must never mix. Never. The Del Reys intended to use...
I have a great regret that he wasn't allowed to go on and create that story specifically, because I think that would have been much, much more interesting, and it would have potentially allowed for him to break out of the mold and to make something that would have been maybe it would have been more in line with the tradition to actually try and cast something outside of this very, very formulaic approach. It could have been something great, but we'll never know, because it was boxed into the formula. It was contained.
Well, I guess he would never have got it published if he had done that, at least by this publisher.
Absolutely, which is part of the problem of having a patronage network that's completely controlled and aiming specifically at containing ideas.
This book and the subsequent franchise as the launching point for both their imprint, Del Rey Books, and their entire philosophy. Colleagues of the Del Reys stated that Brooks's Shannara book was like their baby, and Lester knew exactly what he was doing. Capitalizing on the overt Tolkien imitation, instead of advising Brooks to tone it down, Lester decided to lean into it. He even went as far as hiring the brothers Hildebrandt, who had done numerous iconic illustrations for The Lord of the Rings, to do the cover art for The Sword of Shannara. And the Del Reys' investment paid off. The Sword of Shannara was a major commercial success. It is generally regarded as the book that ushered in the modern age of commercially lucrative fantasy fiction. But Lester was a savvy businessman. He couldn't just sit back and hope that a whole host of new writers would just deliver countless manuscripts to him that would meet the same exacting parameters established and tested by Terry Brooks' The Sword of Shannara. So he decided to be proactive. It was then that Lester Del Rey put together his own formula. This was the mandatory shape all fantasy books submitted to Del Rey must take. The books would be original novels set in invented worlds in which magic works. Each would have a male central character who triumphed over the forces of evil, usually associated with technical knowledge of some variety, by innate virtue, and with the help of a tutor or tutelary spirit.
What do you think of this, AR?
I think you can very, very clearly see the containment within this and the patronage network. You can see that these are the people that are producing the work, and they are gatekeeping what is allowed to be created. And it's very, very overt that they are saying you will make things within this specific mold, or else your work will just not get published. You'll never work in this town again, son.
I mean, in terms of the story outlines themselves, and it should be said that she's slightly oversimplified this because there was a couple of books, or four, I think it's 4 books that they were publishing when they launched the new imprint, the Del Rey imprint. So the Sword of Shannara was just one. Actually, they had kind of created four books of this kind of model, which kind of strengthens her point, actually. What is it about this formula which is containing?
You can see that it's basically hemming in and saying you must hit these story narrative points. It's saying we have a formula for you, and if your book doesn't subscribe to it, it's just never going to you're never going to make it, like I say. Mm-hmm. And that in itself, as soon as you start applying formulas, you begin introducing limits, and you're saying these are where the fence posts are. Beyond this fence post, never ye shall wander. Otherwise, you've gone off the reservation and you're no longer part of this flock.
I suppose I'm wondering though, like, okay, so that's true. But then this formula, is it like it to me, it seems like a hero's journey kind of story that they're looking for, and being anti-technological is something which many of us would see as a good thing, right? So why, is this formula, there doesn't seem to be much that's offensive about it or deeply corrupting.
Granted, that is true, but if you look around today, there's plenty of things that are being done in the political sphere that we would consider to be good. However, they're being conducted by people that we would consider to be bad actors on the grounds of it ensures that you don't wander any further beyond these specific points. They're literally picking out these points and saying, this is as far as you are ever allowed to go. If you go beyond that, you've gone mad.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. It's I would say as well, to me, I'm not sure Tolkien's books would have passed their test. Personally, there's elements there, but if you think about like how the victory is actually achieved in the Lord of the Rings, major spoilers here if you haven't read the Lord of the Rings. After how many years,
2 or 3 people watching this video.
Frodo fails at the end. Now I know Tolkien qualifies that, but just for kind of briefness, Frodo falls to the ring, wants to claim it as his own. He's only saved because Gollum manages to take the ring from him and then falls to his death. Is that a central character triumphing over the forces of evil? Perhaps, but it's not like a clear example of that. It's actually more nuanced and commenting on the kind of flawed nature of all creatures and their inability without maybe divine assistance or providence to overcome evil. So actually this story, this formula might exclude something like the Lord of the Rings from being published, which is ironic given that they're trying to imitate the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I think I would agree. And I would like to offer my deepest sympathies and apologies to whoever that one person is in our audience that that is completely unaware of the ending of Lord of the Rings. I don't know how you stumbled here, but good luck if you did.
I don't know how you still don't know after how many videos on this channel of about the Lord of the Rings. But I would add as well to this, actually, I'm going to add something else. It talks about a central character. Lord of the Rings, I think it's hard to say there's a central character in the way that they're defining it, because especially when he splits the groups off.
Yeah, he splits them into different
books
groups
which don't feature Frodo, and you have books which do. So like the central character, Tolkien wouldn't get published by this publisher. Let's just put it that way.
No, I'd agree, and I think you're right, definitely, on how they split them up. Because even within the groups that they split them up, like you can see the back and forth between Gimli and Legolas, and it almost to some degree dominates a bit more than Aragorn does.
Aye, that's true. That's true. Or you could say like Sam is a more central character than Frodo.
I would actually say there are no side characters in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind. It's like they're making something different, even though it's an imitation. So yes, I think that there's a big question mark here.
It's a cheap knockoff.
Very cheap knockoff.
By innate virtue and with the help of a tutor or tutelary spirit. Other sources include added parameters such as the detail that the male lead character must always get the girl, but I had trouble verifying those sources completely. I've always wondered if this was what Lester Del Rey really believed was the core of Tolkien's work and therefore the reason for its success, this 2-sentence hyper-specific formula, or if he simply pared down the simplest and most recognizable elements of Lord of the Rings and derived a straightforward formula within which he would still have a bit of room for variety. I doubt we'll ever know. I personally looked everywhere for interviews with the Del Reys having more to do with their publishing than with their own writing, and the only one I managed to find was this one, in which the interviewer actually did attempt to get the Del Reys to pin down what, in their minds, constituted a good fantasy book. This was almost impossible to read. The answers were vague, meandering, or just incomprehensible. As for what made a good book good, it seemed ultimately to come down to it having a plot, or it being entertaining, but which, nevertheless, must still remain within his strict, arbitrary, formulaic boundaries. When the interviewer tried to get the Del Reys to explain why those boundaries made a book good, the bizarre, incomprehensible answers always came down to, it's what will sell. However, there
again, I am going to bring back revolution of mass and scale, disaster for humanity. We should not be pursuing purely entertainment within art. I don't even really think, to some degree, that entertainment enters into the thoughts of the artist, or should enter into the thoughts of the artist when they are creating their art. Art shouldn't be something that you pick up as a commodity and go, "Oh, this is interesting. I've enjoyed this," and then put back down. It should be something that resonates with you and that has a deep, meaningful impact. And things that are entertaining are like baubles. They're fun for all of 2 seconds while you hold it. You then toss it away and pick up the next one. That's not what art is meant to be about.
I mean, that's interesting. I actually want to read a section from this interview because I managed to find it, which I think delves a little bit deeper and kind of touches on what was said already. I will switch tabs so you can see it. I don't care how... This is Lester speaking. I don't care how much they comment this is fantasy books on the nature of man. Good fiction of all kinds deals in the nature of man and naturally makes comments on it. That doesn't bother me. All I ask is that underneath it all is a good story that will move the reader along. Not necessarily by formula stuff. I don't want formula stuff, but something that carries an emotional tone, a measure of some kind of action, which can be even mental action, some type of action that keeps the reader moving happily through the book. I want him to finish the thing and say to himself, "Ooh, that was good. That's what I'm after." If it has tremendous depth beyond that, fine. Wonderful. The deeper a book is and can still do that, then so much the better. I wouldn't have, for instance, published Finnegan's Wake because it was too damned hard to read and it didn't carry the reader along fast enough. The philosophical content of it wouldn't necessarily throw me. And I think this gets to what you were just talking about, AR, that the books that they're trying to publish, and they say this consistently through it, it has to be entertaining. That is the primary, within their model, it has to be an entertaining story. And I think they believe their formula is one that will create entertaining stories. And whether it has any depth beyond that is irrelevant. As long as it's entertaining, as long as it's a fun, action-packed fantasy story, which again would probably rule out Tolkien, because if you're looking at like 3 chapters at Tom Bombadil's house, it's probably not going to get published by these guys. Then yeah, this it's driven by that demand. When you talk about mass and scale, could you explain a little bit more how that transforms, like how this, like their books are addressing that thing of mass and scale?
Okay, so mass and scale, and specifically how it applies to these books. I'm of the opinion that once you start introducing formulas, you begin introducing the idea of mass and scale, because that in essence is what mass and scale is. It removes away that element of spontaneity that is required for individual true creation and starts moving towards a more mechanical process whereby you've got a specific set of tasks and you need, like I said before, it's tick box exercises. You're just going through the motions, just making without really thinking or giving it much thought. You're just following a recipe rather than actually creating.
I'd say as well, I think it raises questions about who art's for, because you said that this is reducing art to entertainment, essentially.
Yes.
For a lowest common denominator audience, who's going to enjoy this? How can we make this enjoyable? It doesn't matter if it's artistic. But there is an argument that actually art isn't for everybody, or high art isn't for everyone. That most people don't actually have the ability to engage with high art, and you need to you might have a natural ability for it or not, but you still need to be trained in it. You need to develop that insight and skill to actually appreciate great art beyond the mere pleasure. And I wonder if that's also a factor here, that we're talking about pleasure, but art is actually, like people like Kant and Schopenhauer, for them, art is not actually about causing you to have pleasure. That's treating it as a use, as like a, so you put in a coin and you get pleasure back out. No, it's actually
debases it.
something you appreciate and are changed by. It's very different.
Yeah, that's it. To lower art to purely being pleasure and just pleasure focused is a debasement of art. You're reducing it to, as you say, something for the masses, where art shouldn't necessarily be for the masses. It should be for, it should have a very, very specific audience in mind. And if you're creating for the masses, as has been the discourse for a little while now, and I'm going to probably date this video by saying this, you're creating slop. That's what you're creating, because that's what the masses want. They just want their slop. They don't care if it's about some wonderful creation that you've made. They're happy with McDonald's forever. You could make McArt till the end of time, and the masses would be happy.
Well, I mean, that's this is an interesting point, because let me see if I can find it, because they actually they kind of mention this. Let's see if I can find it. I'll try and be quick. The interviewer says, "I see your point, of course, but wouldn't that lead to the conclusion that the audience dictates totally what is written?" Lester: "In the long run, the audience does, and in the long run, the audience is always right. The best part of the audience, which in the long run is what preserves books, the best part of the buying public have always determined what our great classics are. Those books which somehow or other, over year after year after year, were not bought and read, maybe occasionally taught at schools by some professor who loved them or something, but they are not real classics. I didn't say that the audience won't buy a lot of garbage. The interesting thing, though, is that for a period of time, the garbage may be read, but it's forgotten." So there's an interesting kind of thing there, where they're kind of not being very precise, and they're being a bit inconsistent, because on the one hand, the audience defines everything that they're writing, so they're trying to feed the desire of their audience rather than shape it. At least that's what they're claiming. On the other hand, the audience always has good taste, but they'll actually read a lot of garbage, and the books that they read most are the ones that become classics. I mean, is that true? I don't know.
I'd argue against it. I think it's the populist delusion applied to art. The masses at the very bottom, the base, they're the ones that really decide what's truly great. And it's like, no, they don't. If they're willing to consume absolute garbage, as you've pointed out, they quite clearly don't know what's great. They're just happy to consume whatever they're told to consume. And they're happy to say whatever is great that they're told is great. I imagine if you were to go to some person that's consumed nothing but TikTok or BookTok or whatever it's called, they'd be able to give you a list of absolute garbage titles that they think are amazing. But that doesn't necessarily make them great, and that's what the masses want right now. So no, I don't think that the masses do decide what is and isn't great.
I'm torn on this question, because at the same time, The Lord of the Rings was a bestseller, and so clearly there's a desire within a reading public, which is often poo-pooed by artistic and academic elites, for that kind of story. And as we've spoken at length about why that The Lord of the Rings is so captivating and draws us in and so on. So there's something there which does correspond to a need, I would say, within people. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that need is always going to be the thing that's drawing them in. It could be something else, like the desire for entertainment, or it's being shaped in a certain way by the publisher. That need is getting shaped in a certain way, and maybe it's eating garbage food, but there's a kind of substitute taking the place. So
it specifically reminds me
but it's not like you can't use public opinion as a barometer of classic and not a classic.
Yeah, absolutely. What it specifically reminds me of is the quote by C.S. Lewis about kings. And if you deny a man his king and give him basically the alternatives of sports stars, singers, and he even says men, when denied a king, will worship prostitutes, which, yeah, we're living in that age now with OnlyFans. And it is very much a case of if you deny a man his king, he will gobble poison, whether wittingly or unwittingly. And that is just what the plebeian mindset is. They will eat whatever the rulers tell them to eat. And so that means that the plebeians, the masses, can never actually dictate what is good and great. They always just consume whatever they're given. Whereas there is, to some degree, a cyclical and reciprocal relationship between the creator and the consumer of great art. I say consumer, again, that's dropping back into mass and scale language where you consume art and consume, it's eternal. It just exists. The only thing that it feeds is your eternal soul, and that's what it should feed. That's what it should be, which the masses can't quite interact with art on that level for whatever reason. They will just blindly consume whatever is put in front of them.
I would put in here too as well that actually well, you might disagree with this, but I would say masses, when we're using this, I would include myself in that for a long time, and still to certain extents. It's not, I don't think it's like, maybe there are certain individuals who are distinct from it or in certain groups usually, but generally speaking, we are all in that cycle of mass and scale.
To some degree, I feel I'm going to sound rather big-headed, but I feel I have pulled myself out of it due to the nature into which I was introduced to this world. My upbringing always set me apart, not necessarily in a good or bad way, but I always felt like an outsider. I never felt like I was part of the crowd, whether through self-extraction or exile, effectively. I never felt like I quite belonged with the rest of my kin, which put me on a different path, and probably on the path that has led me to where I am now. But that's getting away from the point. I'm of the opinion that, yes, there is a link between the artist and specifically, I would say, the patron. It's the patron that has that decision and decides what is considered great art and what is not considered great art. There was, I think there was, you quote in a couple of videos back in a stream that we did, the Count of Urbino, I believe, asking, it was, I can't remember what the specific quote was. It was to do with an art exhibition.
It was the artist. Yeah.
Yes. Can you remember the quote?
It was, so Yeats wanted to do, I think it was an exhibition. And he was looking for funding, and a businessman said, well, will the public like this? And Yeats then wrote a withering poem where one of the bits is like, did the Count of Urbino, who, one of the great patrons of the Renaissance, did he consult with the shepherds on the Italian slopes about whether he should go forward with his architectural reforms? Did he, sir? Did he? And obviously the answer is no. But that is the mindset of these sorts of people, where it's like, oh, if people won't like it, then we shouldn't do it. Whereas Yeats is like, no, this is worthwhile because it's great art, and you should do it because it's great art, and you want to be the one who does it. Like, there's a glory in that. So yeah, I guess there's a similarity here. So it's interesting that these guys are just so open about, we're just here to feed that public, and that's our goal. That's where we're taking fantasy down that route.
I can respect the openness and honesty of it, but like I said, it feels like the way between the conversation of the Count of Urbino there, you can see that the masses are just completely excluded from the discussion. They don't get a say. It's like, no. Their opinion doesn't matter. They will believe whatever you tell them to believe is great. And you should do it because it's great.
I mean, even on that front, it's like the masses in the Italian city-states did not really get to see what the Duke of Urbino was really up to.
Yeah.
With the courtiers and the art in his palace and so on. So even then, there wasn't a consideration. Now there is a point about beautifying society and like having a care for the well-being of the individual and the community in our society. So I don't think it's an issue of just cutting off, right? Like that's maybe too far. I think Ruskin has a lot of good points on this, and that there is some value in people engaging with beauty, but it's whether they have that capacity in a culture which is so like doesn't give them that, right? It doesn't show us that. It doesn't help us to learn where beauty is. And it throws in our face other things and says these are the beautiful things when they're not.
Yeah.
Most people have the ability to transcend that. Probably not. And it takes very exceptional people to truly break from that. So I think it's it gets into very deep questions about society and how we should structure it and so on. Fundamentally, there's so many assumptions about that in here, and the lady here doesn't really get to grips with that, does she? She's going to criticize their influence on it, but she never really thinks through, okay, where does that lead in terms of story making?
Which again, bringing it back to a space I was in earlier on the week, is kind of where great art is actually formulated. You need to be asking these questions, because if you're not asking these questions, you're just going to continue on following the formulas indefinitely.
Yeah. Let's carry on. There's so much more that could be said, but I appreciate we're not even halfway through yet.
Very specifically, you're going to continue on following the wrong formulas. There are correct formulas to follow.
Why things that sell was inaccurate and incomplete. It goes without saying that even that was subject to their own completely subjective view. All talk about this bizarrely specific formula aside, it did, like it or not, prove to be successful for a time. Now, remember, the creation of Del Rey books, the publication of The Sword of Shannara, and the birth of Lester Del Rey's formula all also coincided with the emergence of two other brand new publishing phenomena: the major chain bookstore and mass market paperbacks. Lester's business model was simple: accessible fantasy books that scratched the Tolkien itch for the survivors of the Tolkien fever at a cheap price in shops that were everywhere. The brand new shopping mall typically came complete with a B. Dalton or a Walden Books, and Lester wanted to put his $3 fantasy paperbacks in each and every one of them. And so he did, to great success. You can probably guess what happened next. All the other publishers looked at Del Rey Books, making all kinds of money with their paperback fantasy books, all of which fit into Lester's strict formula, and they started to do the exact same thing. Several other publishers opened fantasy lines and started churning out paperbacks published according to the same winning formula. In 1980, Tom Doherty founded Tor Books, and for quite some time paid strict attention to Lester's model. Even a decade later, in 1990, when they published Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time, this formula was forefront in their mind. As editor Patrick Nielsen Hayden said, "We looked at how Del Rey made Terry Brooks, and we did that." I don't particularly feel like debating whether or not some or all of these books have any value. Lester Del Rey didn't really view fantasy literature in that way. He regarded fantasy and science fiction as having a built-in limited shelf life. His aim was to capitalize on his era's tastes and cultural demands in order to make a profit. A side benefit.
I mean, there's a couple of points there. One is just we see this all the time, but the fact that this guy was an innovator in terms of capitalizing on or making fantasy into a profitable business, and then everybody else just copies him. So before this, it's interesting. Earlier she was saying nobody would touch Terry Brooks apart from Lester Del Rey. But as soon as money enters the picture and he makes a lot of it, they're all willing to throw out their principles out the window and start following suit. So they present themselves as taking a high stand, but actually they were just as much driven by money as he was. And then just tying on to that, the language she's used here is it's been turned into a commodity. It's no longer something which is we're doing for an artistic sake. It's something that we can churn this out, we can make a profit, we move on to the next one, and it's very much then attentive to the time rather than making a timeless work, as it were.
Yeah, I think there's some good points. I think it is very much a case of just it's all been commodified, and you can see how the money power enters into it, and suddenly all of the publishing houses fall in line. That is the patron coming in saying, "This is what I want now," and this is the publishing houses jumping in line and saying, "Yep, okay, we'll make that." The like you said, they've got the pretense of, "Oh no, we have our principles," but the principles immediately go out of the window as soon as the patron steps through the door and says, "Change of plans, guys. We're making this now."
It was the people's entertainment. Whether or not entertainment is a good enough literary motivator all by itself is not the topic of this video. The main point I want to make here is that Lester Del Rey was explicitly uninterested in making anything that had any cultural staying power or value beyond its $3 price tag. He didn't see this as a worthwhile pursuit and was openly critical of anyone who sought to champion this type of writing. A book, to him, was a commodity, a product, like a bar of soap, intended to be written, published, purchased, read, and then forgotten. Lester Del Rey, the man who we can all agree built and shaped the modern fantasy publishing genre, did not believe that fantasy was anything more than a product, and the entire industry followed suit. This philosophy of his was very pleasing to the new corporate overlords of the publishing world, mega companies that believed nothing was more important than the bottom line. This philosophy was consistent with the ethos of a world that was newly emerging in the 1970s and 80s, a world of shopping malls and chain stores and mass-produced everything. It was like the universe aligned and cleared the path for the Del Reys to build the fantasy genre we would all be forced to inherit. Even though the initial formula proved relatively successful, it only served to produce or mass produce a product that would only sell as long as the demand existed. Putting aside the monstrous crime against literature writ large that the Del Reys perpetrated with their hugely lucrative and hugely influential philosophy, this simply can't work forever. David G. Hartwell, writing in the New York Times in 1990, had this to say about the result of the Del Reys' control over genre fiction as manifest already in his own times. In 1990, we as readers are the inheritors of this phenomenon. Unquestionably, it created an enormous wave of trash writing to fill the neurotic hungers tiny nuances and gestures overlaying mediocrity and repetition as true originality. The 60s.
It should be noted that David Hartwell was a rival publisher to the Del Reys, so he does have a dog in the fight here, and he's not just a neutral commentator, as she's kind of suggesting. But AR, is there anything you want to comment on in what she just said?
No, absolutely. I think you're right there. It doesn't surprise me that he's a rival commenter. It's very much in line with the. Did you watch? Have you seen the video that A did breaking down how patronage networks work and that they are basically cartels and that's how they function?
Yes.
Yeah, because when you understand it as this is basically a rival cartel saying, "Hey, you've tread on our turf," and you can see this little war going on between the two of them, where there's kind of having a little bit of a beef over, "Ooh, maybe I can steal some of your turf, and that'll get me some more money." It's more power and money, and it's just that game being played out. And it's funny that she picks up on the fact that obviously it has been commodified. They've turned literature into a commodity, and you have these sort of following on from the commodification, you then have these dirty fights between what are effectively cartels over who gets to control the production.
And sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say, because it's been turned from art into just who can churn out the most slop the quickest.
Begat the 70s. The 70s begat the 1980s. And anyone who experienced the late 70s and 80s knows all too well just how gluttonously weird and debauched that time was. The 1990s brought about a cultural counter-revolution across the board, and that included fantasy literature. Just as the Western world sloughed off the over-the-top glitz of 80s rock and replaced it with 90s grunge, it was also time to slough off the tired, stale Del Rey formula. This, then, a literary world saturated with Del Rey's factory-produced Tolkien knockoffs, and those paperbacks mass-produced by Del Rey's imitators, was the world in which the second actor in our drama opened his eyes. Enter Michael Moorcock. I want to mention, there were a lot of writers who came to react negatively to the proliferation of the Del Rey's philosophy. The main reason I've singled out Michael Moorcock is because he is often styled the anti-Tolkien, and he was particularly vociferous about his dislike of what he deemed Tolkien-esque speculative fiction. He was also very influential. Many other writers took their cues from him. Now, this video is not concerned with Moorcock's work as a writer, but rather...
I feel like I'm going to have to step in here because this is where I think there's a bit of nuance that she's lacking, in that Moorcock, and we could talk about his Tolkien views, that's a different matter. He was writing before the Del Rey publishers, like the Del Rey imprint, and he was doing a lot of his work prior to that point. In the 1960s, he was an editor of an influential science fiction pulp magazine, New Worlds, and he was promoting authors like Ray Bradbury, who were challenging what was called the golden age of science fiction, which had been kind of developed by a man called John Campbell, who Lester Del Rey got his big break with. Another couple might be Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, who did Starship Troopers. All these guys are kind of tied to John Campbell's golden age. And Campbell was a seriously right-wing fellow. And Moorcock, he wanted to break the model that Campbell had, the kinds of stories which the Del Rey formula kind of fits with, but he wanted to develop that. And so that you get these characters who are the total opposite, and she'll talk about this, but the timeline's important here because actually the Del Rey imprint is a reaction to Moorcock and Co. trying to steer fantasy away, science fiction and to a lesser extent fantasy, away from those like the hero's journey stories in the pulp fiction magazines to ones where the hero is basically an anti-hero, that evil isn't defeated, that sexual licentiousness is celebrated. It's a very communist, left-wing sort of ethos and values in these stories. Del Rey's kind of pushing against that and saying, no, we need to return to the stories that made the golden age of science fiction. So I think if you understand the timeline, the Del Reys, although we might be very... we might see what they're doing is somewhat cynical or containing, it is trying to restore a form of storytelling that Moorcock and Co. have already been attacking before they're on the scene with their publishing.
That is quite interesting because obviously that is the rise of a sort of, how should we say, adversarial cartel that isn't just in the same vein as we've been discussing before. That's someone coming in trying to carry out a hostile takeover, whereas the reaction sounds to have been a sort of rearguard action against it, saying no, we should continue on with, or at least try to continue on with the tradition. But you can see it's already starting to flag because it's already going down this very formulaic route of we just need to keep copying Tolkien. We need to keep copying Tolkien better, and then we'll win. It's like, no, that's not. You can't beat what's coming using that. Once you're reacting, you're losing.
Yeah, so I can see, at least though, I can see a positive to the Lester Del Rey, that he's, in some ways, he may not even be the true instigator of what he's doing. He's actually trying to resurrect a form which needs but doing it in the wrong way, or holding on to the surface level, unable to actually recapture that magic, because you can't recapture that magic, as it were. So maybe he's a bit more sympathetic than she's going to go and say, but the timeline helps to kind of clarify that, I think.
Yeah, that does flesh it out a bit.
With his more influential role as an editor and generally a tastemaker in the world of speculative fiction. In 1964, Moorcock became the editor of New Worlds, where he would remain, besides a brief 5-year absence from 71 to 76, until 1996. It was here, within the pages of New Worlds, that Moorcock would champion what he deemed a counterculture revolution against this world that had been, by and large, created by the Del Reys. His very first essay for New
But just listen to the timeline that she's given there. He's editor in 1964. They start publishing in 1977. So like,
yeah, she's already blown the game there, saying, "Oh yeah, he was in way before I've just gone on to explain, or way before I was stipulating."
So he's actually attacking the John Campbell Golden Age and the fantasy that comes from that, which the Del Rey is a inheritor of, or a disciple of. So I think that's an important change there.
Worlds, published in 1964 when he took over, heavily suggested that he intended to bring a new flavor to science fiction. Interesting as that may be, it doesn't really have anything to do with our topic. It wasn't until Moorcock published his essay Epic Pooh that he really made clear his thoughts on the publishing industry of his time. Now, there are a lot of people out there who have thoroughly addressed just how wildly nonsensical Moorcock's poorly written takedown of Tolkien really is. So much so, in my opinion, that I found myself wondering if the man had actually read Tolkien. But what struck me as particularly notable was that Moorcock
Moorcock has admitted that he did not read the whole of the Lord of the Rings. So if you have ever read Epic Pooh, have you read Epic Pooh, AR?
I have not.
Save your time. He didn't even read the whole thing before criticizing.
I think I will.
Like George R.R. Martin, like so many other critics of fantasy literature at that time, assumed that this, which he loathed with every fiber of his being, was due solely to the influence of Lord of the Rings, as if Tolkien had personally, with his own hands, formed 1960s and 70s fantasy literature. And as I think I've made abundantly clear, Tolkien actually had nothing to do with it. The world of Western fantasy against which Moorcock railed so violently was not ruled by the influence of Tolkien, but by the influence of Lester Del Rey. Now, defending Tolkien's honor isn't really the purpose of this video, but I think it is worth mentioning that among many other tragedies caused by Lester Del Rey's Tolkien imitation formula and its insane, monstrous success was that it made Tolkien the bad guy, the imaginary villain in some cultural war within Western publishing that simply never took place. Most of the critical examinations of modern Western fantasy publishing that I've come across name Tolkien as the primary villain in the production of this vast world of samey, boring, formulaic, overly simplistic, mass-produced slop. And that's just, not true. Of course, they use other words too, like chauvinistic, sexist, and so on. I mean, please allow me to redirect.
The war did take place, just not as she understands it. And I find it funny that she uses the word slop.
Yeah,
maybe she is more in tune with us than we realize.
Perhaps she's lurking in this chat right now.
Maybe she is lurking, but there is also the possibility that the power of slop as a term has just transcended our little circle.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. I guess. I mean, there's somebody who's not been mentioned yet, but I think is a huge influence on this, and that's Robert E. Howard and Conan the Barbarian. And I wonder if, to me, although Tolkien's work is very much being imitated, the sword and sorcery genre, which Del Rey kind of supercharges and turns into novels from the pulp magazine era, Howard's Conan is a huge influence on that and the kind of characterization of those stories. So I do wonder if Tolkien maybe is getting all of the blame, but maybe some of it, or all of the attack. But actually, Howard is a big part of that too.
Yeah, I think that's fair. She obviously just went into this very much focused on Tolkien.
But I would also say, like, because she's right, Moorcock and Martin and co. all talk about Tolkien. But to me, actually, the pulp magazines and Howard, and with Conan and so on, they're probably more of an influence on them than Tolkien is.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I
And
think
more
the other
what they're
thing,
reacting to.
yeah, I think the other thing is to give George's dues. I do imagine that George has probably actually read Lord of the Rings all the way through.
Yeah, I think he has. To be fair to him, and when he talks of, he's never characterized himself as an anti-Tolkien. To be fair,
Yeah, I think he's even said that he
Moorcock
admires
has.
him.
Yeah, Moorcock has said he is, like, very vociferously against what Tolkien stood for, and what he perceives Tolkien stood for, I should say. As you say, Martin admires Tolkien, and perhaps that's reflected in the kind of work he's written, which is an epic, with, epic in terms of length, in terms of building, and so on, in a way that other writers like Moorcock, to me, belong more to that pulp fiction, episodic storytelling, shorter stories, whereas Tolkien and Martin are lengthy writers.
Yeah, you can sort of feel that George R. R. Martin, for all he lives within Tolkien's shadow, he did come quite close. Certainly within our paradigm, he's the closest thing we've got to a Tolkien. It feels tragically, but
Yes,
I guess that's just the times we live in.
it's the times we live in. It's the times where people want to know what Aragorn's tax policy would have been. That's the times we
Yeah,
live in.
that's a perfect way to explain it, and it's a perfect encapsulation of mass and scale.
Your attention to Lester Del Rey's formula. But because Moorcock assumed this world was due to the influence of Tolkien, he manufactured, either deliberately or as a powerful influence, a childishly contrarian counterculture, which was ultimately little more than a direct and deliberate mirror opposite, not of Tolkien, but of Lester Del Rey. Moorcock looked at the world of Del Rey and his imitators and blamed Tolkien. Most who had grown tired of the inane formulaic output of these now established fantasy lines also blamed Tolkien. The formula had grown stale, as all formulas inevitably will, and so counter-formulas emerged, creating a trend all their own. As is always the case when a formulaic endeavor becomes tired and stagnant, the counter-response to it is almost always its mirror opposite, that is to say, just another formula. And a formula that is nothing more than, as I said, mere contrarianism. This formula was pretty easy. Everything Del Rey said, but do the opposite. Del Rey says Tolkien thought industrialism was bad, so we're going to have lots of industrialism in our books.
Again, age-old. If you're reacting, you're losing.
Del Rey said Tolkien's heroes were all noble and virtuous. No, they weren't. So our characters are going to be drug addicts, selfish, degenerate, incestuous villains, and so on. Del Rey says that in Tolkien, evil is always destroyed, and in Del Rey's books, the hero always wins. Therefore, in our books, the hero doesn't win. Or if he does, it's because he became bad or whatever. Tolkien and Del Rey didn't put sex in their books. You guessed it, there's going to be so much sex in our books. It's so obvious that it actually got to the point, at least with Martin, that I just had to ask myself, if Del Rey had published this book, what would happen next? And whatever the opposite of that was, that's what happened next. At the end of the day, it was just another formula. Moorcock and Martin's complaints about his era's fantasy literature initially feel like they are anti-Tolkien, as many of the elements of Del Rey's formula were plucked directly from Lord of the Rings. But in reality, these writers waging their important and noble crusade against Tolkien are rebelling against nothing more significant than some random salesman's relatively successful product model. That's it. Moreover, like most people who let out this huge, energetic, knee-jerk, reactionary complaint about whatever is most firmly established, such as Moorcock rebelling against established fantasy publishing, at first it comes across like innovative, unique creativity. But then, after you think...
Part of it being a war is you can feel that it's not just a rebellion. They kind of win, especially with George. It's like it's not a rebellion. They've been picked up by the patronage network and they've won, so to speak. It's one cartel moving in and ousting the old one and saying, "Look, this is how things are getting done now." And that's what you can sort of feel. It doesn't feel like I say, it doesn't feel like a rebellion. It feels more like a revolution.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, remember at this time, these guys who are promoting this are going on Vietnam demos, anti-war demos, and so on. They are not just kind of how would you put it?
Politically
They're
neutral.
not, they're not like Tolkien, who's just working in an Oxford college somewhere,
Yeah.
who produces a book. They're wrapped up in this political world where there are patronage networks supporting certain groups to succeed and fail. And a lot of these protest movements are heavily funded by certain groups. So there is a value if the Del Reys represent, as I think we've been alluding to, government interests in terms of the publisher literally works for the government's military of defense, the American government. Then if there's others who want to undermine that or different factions, then surely promoting a brand of fantasy which challenges that is going to be an effective way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
About it for longer than 5 minutes, you realize that most of these people are simply memorizing everything Lester Del Rey said, and then they're saying the opposite. That's not unique thought. It's just another formula.
L is for the way you look
Another
at
advert.
me.
Even now, many are becoming fatigued by this new Game of Thrones era of bleak, ultra-grim fantasy, and they are responding with a new cycle of subversion and contrarianism. As is the case with Catherine Addison in her horrible, horrible The Goblin Emperor, which she herself admits was, at least in part, a counter-response to Game of Thrones.
It is a book that was quite deliberately trying to do several things that fantasy right now has not been doing, because so much of fantasy right now has been so influenced by George R.R. Martin. But it does mean that things have been very grim and bleak and pessimistic and cynical. So it is deliberately, it's not a utopia, but it is utopianist in that it is arguing that doing the right thing will win. That it
You can
What do you want
feel
to say to this?
you can feel the reactionary death spiral just going down the drain. Just, oh yeah, I reacted to them reacting, to them reacting, to them reacting, and it's just you can feel it just sliding down the hill. It's just
Absolutely, yeah.
just the descent into utter slop. It started off with slop, and now we're just at some kind of uber slop level where it's like, yeah, you've done a spin on the slop that they did on a spin on their slop. We're literally like approaching sort of Indian street food level of garbage creation here.
And I mean, one thing that I found very kind of pointed in what she said was that, I wanted to convey the message, as it were, that doing the right thing wins. And to me, as soon as you've got into that territory where it's, I want to convey this very clear idea in response to George R.R. Martin, then it's become propaganda. It's no longer an organic rising story, is it? You've shaped the story to fit that. And somebody like Wagner actually faced this problem because
all right.
When he was writing the Ring Cycle, one of the great works of art of all time, when he started out, he was an anarchist socialist in 19th century Germany, and he did believe that they could overthrow the kind of capitalist state and establish, the free reign of equal men in Germany. But the Ring Cycle ends with Ragnarok, right? And the burning of Valhalla and the tragedy of Brunhilde and Siegfried both dying. Again, spoilers for a 200-year-old work. And he realized as he was doing it, okay, on the one level, my rational brain is like, yes, we can triumph as humans over this over this political system. My intuition is more in line with the tragic ending of the Ring cycle. And so, although the first three operas kind of lead towards this idea of political utopia, actually, deep down, I understood that this all ends in tragedy, and we cannot do that. Like, we are human beings, we are fallen human beings. So he had to reconcile what he ideologically believed with his artistic intuition, and came to shift his political views as a consequence. It feels like she's using her rational brain and trying to force what creativity she's got into a prison of her rational brain, and not allowing the intuition to guide her, the uncontrolled kind of sense of where the story should go.
Yeah, when you're creating art, the VS lawyer sat atop the elephant should be quietly seeing which way the elephant wants to go and just letting it go unless it's heading off a cliff. I think hearing that Wagner was ANCAP when he was younger, I think that there needs to be a reformulation of that saying of if when you're young you're not a leftist, you have no heart, and then when you get older and you become conservative or whatever, if you don't do that, you've got no brain. I think it needs to be reformulated to, if when you're young you're not some kind of social ANCAP, you have no heart. And if as you grow older you do not fall into the world of tradition, you've got no brain and no soul.
Absolutely. While we're stopped, I have just discovered, so I was looking who publishes A Song of Ice and Fire. It is Bantam Books, an American publishing house owned entirely by Random House. Bantam Dell imprint in the 1990s was then merged with Ballotine Books in 2010. So the legacy of the Del Rey empire, which isn't really as strong as it once was, but promoted Ballotine Books, worked for Ballotine Books. This is now what it's become. Game of Thrones is the new Del Rey empire. So just what you're talking about in terms of a takeover, it's almost like this cartel has been like, okay, we're going to incorporate them actually into our fold now.
Yeah, genuinely remarkable. You can literally, like you say, you can directly see, look, there's the cartel taking over. There it is. It wasn't a rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
It was a revolution. The revolution has won, comrades. We have stormed the front with steel, and we have found mush. We have pushed and won.
That if you try your best to be ethical and compassionate, you will come out on top.
So, as the established fantasy genre evolved, one formula begat a predictable counterformula, which begat a predictable counterformula, and so on forever, leading us now in current year to peruse the shelves of our local Barnes & Noble and think, golly, this sure is pretty far removed from that, must be new and unique. Is it though? Is Game of Thrones progressive and intelligent just because it's so different from the Sword of Shannara? Does that really make one good and one bad? For that matter, how far removed really is this from this? I mean, really. Let's take a step back and look at what we have. The beginning of fantasy as a genre, as introduced to the reading public by Tolkien's Lord of the Rings phenomenon, was hijacked by an opportunistic editor in post-industrialist America whose one goal was to produce a successful product model. For at least 2 decades, that dominated the fantasy genre. The fantasy genre entered American consciousness, probably Western consciousness, in this form. When the time came for it to become tired and loathsome, Moorcock and his ilk countered with an equally tired and equally loathsome formula. Fantasy, as we have it now, is little more than the continued response to Del Rey's initial output. Like rebellious sons anchored by the paltry inheritance left them by their reckless father, modern fantasy authors such as Martin and his imitators who wish to maintain relevance within this genre still subsist on this imagined crusade against some broad, hazy publishing philosophy that they believe dominated their industry immediately after Tolkien.
Pausing. You can see this isn't some sort of it literally is the revolution never ends, comrades. On we go. It's not a rebellion. It's the endless revolution.
The endless revolution, but it's sponsored by the same people, whatever side wins.
Yeah, exactly.
They just, or if there ever was a revolutionary impulse, it gets consumed and then pushed even harder. Martin himself is just like, because I do think Moorcock, to be fair to him, was working in independent stuff and didn't really hit the big time in the way that others did. But by the time you get to George R.R. Martin, he's part of the network now. He's literally publishing books for the publisher who was promoting the stuff he hated.
Yeah.
Little realizing that they are fighting no greater enemy than basic corporate greed, and that they are doing so in service of still more basic corporate greed. But at the end of the day, no matter what form the newest formula takes, the big corporate overlords just look around and see which one is probably going to generate the most revenue, and then they issue their decrees. Thus, when the anti-Tolkien Game of Thrones became the flavor of the decade, just as Del Rey's boring fantasy had been the flavor of the 60s and 70s, the machine that Lester Del Rey created that would mass-produce paperbacks based on derivations of whatever trend was popular at the time calculated a few variations on the Game of Thrones formula, and put it to work. Lester Del Rey's formula engine is still going strong, even though his original formula has been largely abandoned. This engine is, in fact, the power source for the Western fantasy genre. Lester Del Rey's fantasy formula experiment was proof of concept to the entire newborn publishing industry of the 60s and 70s. They looked at him and how he did things, and that was how they built the foundation of modern publishing. All modern publishing. Now, something you might ask, and it's not an unfair question, is what does it matter? So what if Del Rey Books and thereafter all book publishing use a series of formulas to create an endless supply of arguably entertaining books? It only matters that they're entertaining, right? Who cares if they're not mega epics like Lord of the Rings? First of all, as I've said before, aside from how incredibly well crafted it is in itself, one very big reason we think of Tolkien's work as so extraordinary is because after it appeared, there was never again anything like it or even on its level.
The containment there, you can see that the formulas that's laid out ensures that another Lord of the Rings isn't going to come along, because it explicitly precludes the epic, and it goes for the little bite-sized sort of, what's the word? It goes for the bite-sized entertainment. It does. It's not interested in the epic. It's interested in the small-scale bite-sized entertainment, which is in almost, if I'm right, direct adversary to what she said before.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's. I mean, she's clocked on here that it's a false dialectic that they're all serving each other. Like every book serves whatever's going to sell. I think where I think she's kind of maybe not fully appreciating or fully investigating is the idea that, so she says like Martin is the flavor of the month and that's why the publisher goes for it. I would suggest the publisher makes Martin the flavor of the month, just as Del Rey made the Sword of what was it called? The
Sword of Shannara.
The Sword of Shannara, the flavor of the month. It's through their marketing. It's through the way that they're presenting it. It's through getting influencers or other people to read it and promote it. That's how it became big, because people read Game of Thrones for a long time and it wasn't a huge cultural phenomenon. I would argue when the TV show happened,
that's when it became the cultural phenomenon.
That's when it became a cultural phenomenon. So it's not just about the book being out there. It's who's promoting it and how it's promoted, whether it sticks or lands. As a cultural phenomenon. So the publisher and those who are promoting these stories have a very important role in kind of shaping that. To a certain degree, Lord of the Rings in more recent times has that too, because although it's a huge thing in the 60s, like for me, it's the films that got me into it. So if it hadn't been adopted by New Line Cinema and the Weinstein producers, right? Well, if it hadn't been promoted by them, then it doesn't happen, and I probably have a lot less chance of reading The Lord of the Rings.
Absolutely. Absolutely,
So
I'd 100% agree. And I find it quite funny though, because she has the understanding of what a flavor or taste maker is, because she discussed them earlier.
yeah,
So she should know that. Yeah, no, it's not a case of like, oh, they're just reacting to the market forces. No, they're driving the market forces.
hmm and creating works which are
Yes.
going to react to the old works, and thus the cycle, as you say, the revolution always keeps on going,
Yeah.
and the coffers get full.
Point though, that it doesn't matter if it's all formulaic as long as it's entertaining. But I have two major issues with that. One is that entertaining is inherently subjective. What's entertaining to one person might be dull as powder to another. So from a strictly business perspective, the model is flawed. Second, and I believe this is the larger issue and the one that's harder to drive at directly, entertainment for the sake of entertainment can be fun, but it's a lot like convenience store pastries. Twinkies are great, but that can't be the only thing you eat. If it is, you'll die. That doesn't mean that you have to eat only dry wheat bread and unsalted carrot mash for the rest of your life. Ideally, your healthy food is also delicious. Similarly, the goal of every writer who wants to write something that's a bit more than a 2-week bestseller that's forgotten forever before the end of the month is write something that is both beautiful and important and that entertains. I have no intention of sitting here and defining what it is that makes a book beautiful and important, but I can tell you 100% such a book simply will not ever be published by the formula-driven fantasy machine created by Lester Del Rey. Entertainment, and by that I mean the arts, is a
Yeah, it's not going to get published by them because, as we say, it's controlled by the people that are deciding what does and doesn't get published. And they've made it quite clear, we don't want another Lord of the Rings ever again. We would be quite happy to sit here as our little cartel in control till the end of time if we can. But that's not what's going to happen.
Oh, exactly.
crucially important aspect of the human condition, kind of like food. Just as mass-produced food makes people unhealthy, the same goes for mass-produced entertainment. We've entered an era when all Western entertainment is corporate formula slop. Yes, all of it. So if even our fantasy literature can only be more mass-produced entertainment for the sake of entertainment, at some point we're going to reach a kind of Twinkie entertainment critical mass as a civilization, if we haven't already. Now,
based. Very based if I don't notice these things.
Yes, it is a very good analysis, and it's what we were talking about earlier, that art and entertainment are distinct things, and actually, but she's adding something to this, which is the committee-based nature of so much work today. That it's taking that idea of a formula and pushing it to the nth degree, where we can just we don't even need a sole creator anymore, or an artistic vision. At least you could say with Terry Brooks and these writers that, okay, maybe they're imitating, but I have a belief that Terry Brooks wasn't just doing a formula, that he liked the story that he was creating, even if it was very derivative. Whereas today you've got a committee of people sitting down and saying, okay, we need this, we need that, we need this. Bang, there's your story.
Absolute box-ticking exercise.
Yeah, and very soulless as a consequence.
Yeah,
very soulless.
Yeah, that's it. You can feel that what Terry Brooks was trying to create was single-minded vision. It was his vision that was being created, even if it was just a copy. It was his and his alone. It wasn't a creation by commission where it was purely just a box-ticking exercise.
Don't get me wrong. I think stories absolutely must be entertaining. I think it is a storyteller's obligation to entertain their audience. However, if entertainment is the publisher's only aim, then I think they've missed the point by a country mile. Also, I think allowing a bunch of corporate overlords to decide how it is that we are entertained is troubling. Additionally, there is a difference between following popular trends and adhering to an industry formula. One is organic and follows its own natural path and life cycle. The other is corporate and profit-driven. And the thing,
as we can see, however, the patron factors into this. and makes it so that there is no organic grassroots from the bottom up. It's always, always, always decided by the person in charge. That's just how it works.
Mm-hmm. Someone is deciding what's getting promoted somewhere.
Yeah.
And there may be a lot of fighting over that between different groups, but there is somebody who's pushing something. It isn't just, oh, we all discovered this book all of a sudden and now it's the best thing ever.
Yeah, it didn't just spring from the ether. Someone handed it to you. There was someone there putting that book into your hand.
Mm-hmm. So I think it's unrealistic kind of assessment there.
Thing is, because that machine and that business model exists as the foundation of Western publishing, it's basically impossible for anything other than Twinkies to ever be published. And in the rare case that such a book is published, it's an absolutely Herculean task. Is it possible to save Western fantasy publishing? I don't know. Listen, nothing is stopping you from writing a great fantasy novel. Nothing is stopping you from ignoring what is or isn't part of the formula and just writing what you want to write. Whether or not you'll be able to publish it is another matter. But the fantasy publishing world, such as it is the world that Lester Del Rey built, and it's the one we live in. Maybe we can fight the giant corporate monster and its formula engine. Maybe we can't. Maybe knowledge like this will lead some writers to despair and put down their pens forever. Maybe this knowledge is driving force enough to make that one person out there write the masterpiece that ends up on the shelf next to Lord of the Rings.
Maybe we don't have to fight it. Maybe one day, as E.M. Forster predicted, the machine just stops. And that's that.
It is possible. It is possible. I guess there's a point to be made here, isn't there? Of if this is how the system works and the publishing system is working, then it's unrealistic to think that, at least in the near future, that anything which is breaking from this cycle of revolutions against your golden age, your Moorcock, your Del Rey, your Martin, etc. It's just not going to happen, and so kind of accepting that in your artistic practice and thinking about, okay, who am I actually reaching with this, is probably a good thing to do. Like it's not necessarily a bad thing, because as we've been saying, that actually what's being done here is appealing to making an entertainment product for millions of people to consume. Whereas actually, if you're going to be the next Tolkien, you don't want to. That's not your goal. Your goal isn't to create the next thing for the millions to consume. It is to create a great story, and that is a very different project. So in some ways, the fact that it's so hard, it kind of frees you from being crushed by that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the other part of what I really like about this video in particular, is that at the end, regardless of everything before this point, she has ended up at the right orientation, whereby she's saying, go forth and create.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what the industry is doing. Go make your masterpiece. Do it, because you can.
Well, I don't think there's much more to see here. I think she's just going to reiterate that point that you've just said. So I think we can leave the video there. And I just want to ask, is there anything you felt that we haven't really touched on, or things you wanted to kind of speak further on in relation to this topic?
I think we've pretty much covered everything, and the video was already potentially going to be around about 2 and a bit hours long.
It is, but we're all here for long form videos. That's what dominates YouTube these days. Although on the Corncrake we go for half hour things usually. So we've definitely departed from that, but I felt it deserved it, and it's a subject which is worth, like, because we've been having a lot of discussions on the channel of late about the current situation in fantasy writing within the genre, how it developed, how it's got to this point, what are future directions. And most of that discussion has been literary in nature, you know, the literary legacy of different people and how they engage with each other thematically. So Tolkien and Moorcock and so on. But we've actually, you know, this video is really insightful because it moves a step back and says, okay, what about the publishers? And how do the publishers shape that literary tradition? So to me, although it's been lengthy, it's actually been really instructive for having a more rounded view of how fantasy has developed and where it's going to go, or if it's going to go anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a fair summary. I think it definitely was worth sitting and going through, because it was just such a fascinating little video just to have pushed on me quite interestingly. It's as we're saying here, you know, we're talking about what does and doesn't get pushed. I found it very interesting that this was pushed when it was.
I hope that she does more videos of this like this in the future. I think that she's definitely got something that until we had seen it, we didn't really know about. So she's done a great job there. I would also add as well as I think I think it's a topic which probably can have more research done into it, because we've been talking about one publisher here primarily. There's a whole story beyond that and beyond the Del Reys, because ultimately, although they were very influential as editors, there's people above them who are shaping the priorities that they had to deal with, about profit margins and so on, and how much money they're going to have to make each year. And as you were alluding to, the weird situation with the defense contracts. So there's more to be fleshed out in this story about who's connected to who and who's making decisions here, and the influences going into the fantasy publishing and science fiction publishing too.
Yeah, I think that is a fair point. There is still more. There's definitely more threads to be pulled within that part of the story, which does make it quite interesting. I'd be quite curious to see what happened on this side of the pond with the publishing, to see if they were also gobbled up by people linked to our government, or if they were gobbled up by people linked to the American government.
Maybe that's for a future Corncrake podcast. Perhaps. Well, I think that's a natural place for us to bring this to a close. So before we finish up, AR, is there anything you would like to promote?
I think I'd like to promote my story within the Corncrake, which is the rather obvious one to go with. If you go over to my Twitter, you'll be able to find it. I think I've renamed my Twitter recently. I think it's now at ER Green. I don't know if there's dots in there or not. I'll have to check. But yes, I think if you go over there and you look at the pinned tweet on my Twitter, you'll find my story.
That sounds good, and I would recommend everybody go and read that. I would just say go and read the Corncrake. It's a great magazine. It's not owned by these big publishers. It's promoting good story writing by independent artists and there's no profit made from the Corncrake. It's just about good stories. Thank you so much for your time, AR. I've really appreciated it and enjoyed this video. I hope that we'll have you on again soon, maybe for a follow-up on this. And all the best for the future, my friend.
Maybe. Thank you very much for having us on. It's been lovely.
See you all soon, friends. Bye for now.
Bye.